Okay, I'm Randi Gressgård, and I'm here to talk about trans debates in Norway and beyond. And together with me, Andrea, do you have a mic? Yeah.
Yes, so my name is Andrea, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Law, and I'm going to participate in a conversation after Randi's presentation. I'm going to try to highlight some of the legal perspectives of these debates.
Yeah, and I'm professor of gender research at the University of Bergen, and my focus is mainly politics. So the presentation I'm going to give now is focusing on the so-called trans debate. So I'm going to say something about this, the rhetorics and the context, and then Andrea will say something afterwards about the legal context, and then we'll have a conversation. We haven't really planned a conversation, so we hope to get some questions from the audience and make it more organic than just dialogue in the sofa. So we'll see what happens. But I'm going to start with my first slide on the polarizing tendencies we see in Norway as well as internationally. And although the trans issues are slightly less weaponized in Norway than in many other countries, we do see some of the same tendencies. And a recent research report shows that 1 in 4 trans people in Norway report being exposed to threats and violence, while 1 in 3 have experienced sexual assaults. Yet, so-called trans-critical voices want to contest not only specific laws and policies affecting trans people, but also the very existence of transgender experience and identities. Many call into question the realness, the so-called realness of trans women and men, especially trans women, arguing that they are not true women and men, and thus diluted or deceitful, and also threatening in many contexts. So that's that argument, and then you have at the same time questioning of the existence of gender identities beyond the binaries, beyond the man-woman binary, where some people argue that there is no such thing as non-binaries, gender fluid or non-gender persons. So this is the in short, the polarizing tendencies that we see, and we also have then related to this a set of tropes that we can identify. And the typical argument would be that trans rights are in opposition to women's rights, as though it were a zero-sum game, as if the inclusion of one led to the cancelling out of the other. And a milder version of this argument, which is quite common in Norway, would be that trans rights are less important than or risk overshadowing cis women's rights, and therefore should be deprioritized in political struggles. The latter argument invokes 2 tired tropes. The one regarding time is that trans rights should wait until more important issues have been solved. And regarding scope, this is not the pressing issue, since trans rights concern only a small minority, whereas women's rights concern half of the population. At stake here are, of course, gender boundaries. The dominant medical discourse echoes these gender boundaries. To qualify for treatment in Norway at the only specialist clinic, you must comply with stereotypical gender norms inextricably linked to heteronormativity. The interrogation at the clinic often comes close to harassment, and up until 2016, the clinic routinely sterilized patients, even if it was not a legal requirement, in order to make sure that trans people could not reproduce. Trans parenthood is still a highly contested issue due to deeply rooted gender norms, especially the view that giving birth means being a mother. Relatedly, trans-critical rhetoric accuses trans people of trying to ban the word mother, as though trans-inclusive language would lead to the erasure of those who do identify as mothers. So we could ask then, what does the trans debate, the so-called trans debate, do? What's the function? What's the aim of the so-called trans debate? Many LGBT issues are currently being politicized in such a way that they are reopened for public questioning or discussion. Especially trans rights have been turned into a veg issue. The media-generated trans debate serves to question issues that are existential to trans people, and thus should not be up for debate in the first place. Trans people have to defend their very existence, much like queer people's lives have been deemed illegitimate. As many have noted, being reduced to a debate is effectively dehumanizing trans people, paving the way for anti-trans legal proposals alongside harassment and violence. Moreover, the trans debate makes trans bodies solely responsible for fighting transphobia, while cisgender privilege entails ignorance as opposed to awareness at best, active opposition or demonization at worst. And I want to give you an example from earlier this year, which concerns the fear of trans propaganda. A theatre play about transgender identity performed in Norwegian schools since 2017 was earlier this year considered offensive by some parents in the Sunnmøre region, resulting in exception for 15 pupils at one school. The public broadcaster NRK interviewed some of the parents and specialists in psychology, Marit Bruseth, who was quoted saying that the play poses a health risk for children. When exposed to transgenderism, vulnerable children could start believing that gender transformation would be the answer to their psychological problems. Bruseth, who is also a leading figure in the Norwegian branch of the organization GENID, which, according to its website, problematizes the modern trans ideology, argues that medical experimentation with children and young people could lead to wrong medical treatment. This familiar script suggests that for one, it's more important to prevent so-called wrong treatment than providing medical service to youth who could benefit greatly from it. And secondly, gender diversity is unwanted and contagious, so that children should be protected from the promotion of trans ideology in schools. So the question arises then, who deserves freedom and safety? Targeting trans, non-binary and genderqueer people in the name of safety is part of a broader concerted effort to erase trans people from public life across the world. Safety arguments about excluding trans women from women's bathrooms, for example, have no concern at all for the freedom and safety of trans people. Many of the dehumanizing arguments applied to trans people have also been used against LGBT or queer people and people of color, compromising minority populations' freedom, dignity, health, and safety to score political points. As we all know, in Russia, Hungary, and Poland, among other places, LGBT people are labeled infiltrators and equated to child abusers by the authorities, even in the letter of the law in the Hungarian case. The attacks on so-called gender ideology aim to reverse progressive legislation won in the last decades. So we should be aware and vigilant, even if the arguments are pro-feminist and pro-gay or lesbian. Thank you for your attention. Yeah, so now it's the start of the conversation. I'm excited.
Yes.
We haven't planned this, so.
Yeah, no, but I listened to your wonderful presentation, and I thought I would start by making a comment on some of the issues that you've raised from also the legal perspective, since that's what I'm working on mostly.
Yep.
And one of the things that really struck me was in your presentation you talk about how polarizing and how sort of intense these debates have become in recent years. And I think this is interesting because also within the legal community, the situation of trans and non-binary people has really not received much attention until the last couple of years, really. And this is despite the fact that there has been a focus on so-called LGBT rights for quite a lot of years in Norway. But in practice, we see that the T, and not to mention the I, sometimes they also use the I, the intersex. In practice, those two letters hasn't really been included, even though it's often the acronym LGBT rights is often used. And on the other hand, the law has very much contributed to limiting trans and gender queer people's lives and their rights. So I think here it's important to note, as Randi was talking about, this previous requirement of sterilization. And as she mentioned, it was never really formulated in legal regulations. But in practice, what was said was that to be able to change your legal gender, you had to prove that you had undergone a full gender conversion. And it was the specialists at the health clinic who decided what that was, and that meant that people had to undergo a full castration. And I think it's really important here to note that it was only in 2016 that we abandoned this requirement. And although this is a very positive development that has been celebrated as securing trans persons' rights, at the same time, from a legal perspective, we see that the state refuses to recognize that this previous practice of sterilizing or castrating people, really, was a violation of of trans people's fundamental human rights. So following this change in law, where we got the new law which says that everyone can change their legal gender based on their own self-determination, we have had 2 court cases in Norway where trans people have asked for compensation, either for being pressured to undergo castration, that is one of the cases, and the other is for being forced to live with the wrong gender in their identity documents because they were not able to change their legal gender because they did not receive treatment at the clinic. In both of these cases, the law has denied that there has been any violation of human rights. So here we see that the law is still sort of having an ambivalent sort of relationship with trans persons' rights. And this sort of lack of safeguarding the rights of transgendered people and gender non-conforming people is also an ongoing issue, as I'm sure many is aware of, Because even though the new law that we got in 2016 allows for people to self-determinate what gender they want to be registered with, it is still only man or woman. And this is despite the fact that we do have anti-discrimination legislation in Norway that says explicitly in the sort of documents prepared for the law that also genderqueer people and gender non-conforming people are entitled to not be discriminated against. And the other issue, which I have found very interesting, is that after the new law on self-determining gender was passed, there has been this debate that Randi was talking about, that now men will change their gender to gain access to women-only spaces, such as changing rooms or toilets. But in fact, what we see is that the law very often does not regulate this issue, because there is no law saying you go to that toilet and you go to that toilet. This is actually governed by social norms. So the new law from 2016 has no consequences in most cases for what changing room you use. And what does this mean? On one hand, maybe some people would be comforted by this. But on the other hand, it means that the situation of trans people are still very difficult, because they don't have a right to go into the changing room that they feel that they belong in necessarily. This is an issue of anti-discrimination, and it's unclear whether or not they would be protected if a trans woman wanted to enter the women's changing room, for example. And the other things that I was thinking about when I heard you talk was also the very polarizing debates we got when recently we expanded the protection against hate crime to include gender identity and gender expression. And in these debates, before this was passed, so it is now a hate crime to attack someone on the basis of their gender identity or gender expression, there were many arguments from politicians saying that what this would actually do was to make it illegal to, for example, say that a man is a man or a woman is a woman. And I think this is an example of these polarizing tendencies that Randi is talking about. And the second debate in the legal context that I wanted to highlight is the current debate on conversion therapy, where we're now debating that it should be illegal to offer services where people are turned straight, but where some groups and some voices have raised concern that this would mean that it would be illegal to help confused children realize that they're cisgendered and not transgendered, or that their gender non-conforming ways is in some way wrong and that we should treat it with therapy. So I think these examples, I just mentioned them to give some examples of how these debates are very much ongoing and very much taking place within legal terms. And I think in ways that could potentially really damage trans persons' rights. So based on this, I prepared some questions that I thought could kick off the debate. And then, as Randi mentioned, we would very much like to have questions from the audience as well. But I thought one thing that I could start off with was just to ask you, why do you think that trans rights in particular are so polarizing in the debates today, while we can see that sexual minorities are not? And this is despite the fact that you can see, as you mentioned, some of the arguments that are being presented. If you went back 30 years or 20 years, it would be the same arguments that was used against lesbian and gay rights. For example, we should not let lesbian women into the changing room. They will stare at the straight women and do inappropriate things. So why do you think it is that trans rights in particular has gotten this polarizing position?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. I think partly it's because of the lack of activism or the, I would say maybe the lack of solidarity that gay and lesbian rights have not. The activism, the various kinds of activism in the LGB field have not been concerned with trans issues, and in some cases even been transphobic because I mean, gay and lesbian identities are cisgendered identities in most cases. So in that sense, the trans issue would be sidelined or even opposed. But I think there's a bigger picture here, and that's how it seems to be more controversial or much more threatening in a way to insist on gender diversity than on sexual diversity. And I think one reason for that is that gender identities are so naturalized, even more than sexual identities, and questioning, especially those trans activists that would question gender binaries, they are, I guess they are seen as more threatening than queer activists are, and I don't think we will see the same development that we have seen in queer politics, where sexual freedoms and rights have been co-opted by politicians, and you have even what Jasper Poir calls homo nationalism, where queer people are, or actually not all queer people, but those not challenging heteronormativity, those white middle class cisgendered queer people have been included in some kind of national propaganda and pinkwashing and so on. And I don't think we'll see that in the trans case, because in the trans field, because challenging cisgenderism or cisnormativity is much more controversial, because gender norms seem to be much stronger in a sense and more naturalized, and therefore so in terms of nationalism, you can't really have a nationalism without cisgenderism, I think. They are so interlinked.
Yeah, that's a really good reply, and I think you're really touching upon something there. And it kind of answers almost my next question as well, which was, why do you think that we see that so-called feminist movements, and also in some cases lesbian groups, have been so vocal and so almost leading the charge against the trans issues and trans rights? And I guess the answer would be some of the same, perhaps. But I don't know if you want to.
No, it's pretty much just. I mean, the essentialization, the gender essentialism is so strong, even in feminist movements and some among some gay and lesbian activists as well. So. Gender essentialism, or the belief in fixed gender identities seem to be very important to some feminists and gay activists as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I had another question as well, because when I listened to your presentation, you were also mentioning how in these debates, what is often happening is that trans people have to defend their very existence.
Yeah.
And that in this case, it kind of reopens a debate over whether or not people have rights, which is a debate we shouldn't even have.
Yeah.
And when you said that, it sort of resonated in me, because now in these days we also see that we have this freedom of speech debate.
Yeah.
And I see more and more often trans issues come up there as one example of the freedom of speech being under threat, because precisely of those kind of statements as you made. So some would say that by saying what you just said, you are limiting free speech either in academia or in general in society. So what would you, how can we meet that kind of argument? Because it seems to be becoming more and more common.
Yeah, I think it's important to see how trans issues are related to racial issues, to racism, and to Islamophobia. It's related to in other parts of the world, very much related to queer issues. And I think we need to see the connections and to connect the dots and see the big picture. It's important to see how these things are politicized in almost exactly the same way. And these efforts are also coordinated by right-wing organizations and strong movements across the world, not only in Eastern Europe, but you also see it in almost all parts of the Western world as well as in other parts of the world. But I think there are so many similarities in how these arguments are being used and how these so-called identity issues are weaponized. So you have some keywords. You have identity politics, you have woke, you have LGBT rights, trans rights, you have critical race theory, you have intersectionality, you have all these terms supposedly pointing to some kind of progressive Marxist liberation movement, threatening the national order, threatening the family, threatening the patriarchy, and even civilization is threatened by these minorities. And but to sum up, I think it's important to see free speech as a rhetoric. How it's not about free speech legally at all. Has nothing to do with. It's not a legal discussion. It's a political discussion. It's 100% politicized and weaponized. So, in order to identify this as a power technique, we need to see it as a powerful political rhetoric.
Wonderful. I was wondering, maybe we should open up for. I have lots of other questions as well, but maybe some.
Maybe I can ask you a question.
Yes, sure.
Because there's a pretty new book in Norwegian. You have a chapter in that book. It's about the legal, not only the legal, but there are several chapters on legal issues and trans issues in Norway. Maybe you could say a few words about your own chapter and maybe make some links to the other contributions as well, just since this is one of very few publications in Norway on trans issues, I think it should be mentioned.
Definitely. It's always wonderful to get a question to talk about the book where you have contributed. That's wonderful. So I can say in Norwegian, the book is in Norwegian, so that's both good and bad, I think. It's good because we need Norwegian publications on trans issues and sexual and minority issues as well. It's bad because maybe makes it a little less open for people to access. But in Norwegian, the book is called... oh, now I get completely forget it. Frihet, likhet, mangfold. There we go. Luckily, some in the Isak in the audience can remind me what the book is called.
So, freedom, equality, and diversity.
Yes. And the book contains several chapters, and the contributors are both lawyers. And psychologists and from the social sciences, and the goal is to really provide an analysis of LGBT and gender non-conforming sexual minorities, legal and societal situation in Norway. My own chapter, a little bit of the reason why I didn't say so much about it in my initial comment is that it's about sexual minorities more than it is about gender identity and gender expression. But in it I write about the right to asylum in Norway on the basis of sexual orientation. And what I'm looking at is really how the law is contributing to sort of constructing or deciding what it means to be a sexual minority. So what it means to be gay or lesbian or bisexual. through the so-called credibility assessment in the asylum procedure. And when I was doing this research, I really wanted to include trans issues as well. The reason why I didn't was that although I got access to 187 cases from the immigration authorities, only one of those cases concerned a trans person, and that was so little that I couldn't include it due to identification issues. But what I saw is that in my chapter in general, I saw how the law is really contributing to not only testing whether or not you're gay or lesbian or bisexual, but really deciding what that means. And I think that's important to be aware of, because I think it also applies to trans people. And I think for refugees, one thing that I can say is that when they do these sort of tests, it's very often, the tests that they're doing is often based on gay asylum seekers' experiences. And because they often talk about LGBT, they might apply, or the knowledge that they have when they're doing these tests is mostly about sexual orientation. And so that makes me question, what will that do if you take your experiences from sexual minorities and you just apply it to trans people? I think that can potentially lead to very bad results, where gender identity and gender expression is confused with issues of sexuality. So that's one concern I have, but I unfortunately wasn't able to really look at it in my chapter. But the other chapters in the book both looks at anti-discrimination protection, and it looks at third legal gender. There is also a very interesting chapter which compares the situation in Sweden and Norway, because if you look to Sweden, they have actually implemented a compensation scheme there. So Sweden also had a sterilization requirement, but unlike in Norway, Sweden has decided to give trans people compensation for that previous practice. And so it analyzes a little bit, why have we not been able to achieve this in Norway? And there are also chapters that sort of look at the health services for trans people and what needs to be done there. And a very interesting chapter on the history of the medical services offered to trans people. So if anyone thinks that sounds interesting, you're very welcome to go out and get the book. You can also borrow it at the library, I think.
Yeah, the chapter on history is by Sigrid Sandal, who is sitting there and is going to talk after us.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I guess, is there any questions from the audience for us? Yes? Should I?
Question from the viewer.
Yeah.
Could you discuss the increase of publicity in anti-trans/gender-critical scholarship and the recent case of Helen Joyce and perhaps more visibly Kathleen Stock, who's now lost her job at the university she was hired at?
Yeah, that's the British context, which is much more weaponized than the Norwegian context, but I think we should pay attention to it because it's highlighting exactly how this polarizing logic, how it works, and also how feminist movements and lesbian, gay activists or scholars are part of this polarizing debate. So it's not a left-right debate. It's more complicated than that. And some arguments are pro-feminist and pro-lesbian gay, so that might be slightly confusing. But I think, yeah, we should be aware of the way that gender essentialism plays a vital role in these debates, and being so-called transcritical means defending the gender binaries and cisgenderism based on some kind of biological notion of gender. So yeah, it's not as simple as right and left politics.
Yeah. I definitely agree that we should pay attention to it. And I think one of the things that we can see when these cases are mentioned is that it often is used to sort of argue that there is a trans lobby that's one unit in a sense. And this unit is coordinated, and it's everywhere across Europe, and it's making these very well thought out attacks on certain academics. So I think it's a very dangerous tendency, because it also presents trans issues, trans people, trans groups as being this one unit that is doing these coordinated attacks in a way that's very dangerous, I think.
Yeah, and also presenting trans people as a very forceful movement, which is of course totally wrong. And I think that at least one important argument in this context would be that trans rights are less important than women's rights, or are for some at least, that's also an issue, that they might not be totally against trans rights, but they still think that trans rights should not be prioritized, and that trans rights have been much more debated and got so much attention, and whereas feminism and women's rights are losing ground, so to speak, which is also some kind of rhetoric and based on false assumptions, of course. So yeah, you have different issues, but I think the basic issue is the gender essentialism behind it.
I also have one comment that's on the legal issues here, which isn't really answering the question. Maybe it's posing a new question, I'm not sure. But I think one interesting aspect is that when we were debating the Marriage Act, the Common Marriage Act, you had a lot of debate in the media and society before the act was passed. And you even had some court cases where some people went to the courts to say that by allowing gay people to marry, you would invalidate heterosexual marriage. And this did not result in a win for these people, but they did try. But when it comes to trans issues, you see that there was very little debate and very little attention in the mainstream society before we got the act in 2016. And this has sort of resulted in many people arguing that this act was passed without the public's knowledge, and that it was a rush job that didn't receive the proper attention in the legal circles, despite the fact that the law was passed in the same way as all laws are. You had an expert committee that carried out a really thorough investigation and published a report for many hundred of pages, and you had open hearings on the act. Despite this, you now have this argument that the act was sort of snuck in without people really knowing. And I think this is an interesting contrast between the Marriage Act and gay rights and trans rights on the other hand. So not really an answer, but a comment.
There is another question. What do you think about Judith Butler's statement regarding TERFs and TERF discourse advancing the rise of fascism in the contemporary?
Yeah, I think I sympathize with Butler's comments on fascism, and I guess this is a reference to a recent piece in The Guardian where she did make
maybe you could summarize the comment, because I know I'm not quite sure what the comment.
Yeah, I mean the connection between anti-trans and anti-LGBT rhetoric and fascism is the lack of consistency and the incoherence in the arguments. It's a sign of fascism when you use all kinds of arguments and inconsistency in different contexts, contradicting arguments to that arguments that target minorities of various kinds, not only trans, but also sexual minorities and racial minorities. And I think that is actually a sign of fascism, and that was Butler's main point. And I think it's a way of raising awareness of these international tendencies.
There's a question coming this way.
Yes. I was hoping you could emphasize a bit on the logic among TERFs, the so-called trans-exclusive radical feminists, in their feminism and their stance against trans people. For me, it seems very illogical that for decades the feminist movement have tried to make the argument that we are not just our genders, that our biology does not determine who you are and who you get to be, and this sort of notion that we are more than men and women, that doesn't necessarily restrict us, that we have genders and to expand beyond gender norms. But as soon as there's T people involved, it suddenly becomes very important to uphold the biological determinism around what kind of sexual organs you have, determine what rights you have and what spaces you can occupy in society. So what's the logic? Why do they think like this? What's the sort of logical argument? Why is this gender issue so sensitive for someone who spent their lives arguing that we are humans first?
Well, I don't think they actually did that. I mean, they did argue that we are humans, but I don't think they gave up the idea of biological foundation or idea of some kind of essence. Even though the split between biological sex and social psychological gender have been extremely important in arguing that biology is not determining us. It's still there. It's as a fundament. So you can change a lot, gender expressions, and you can have various, kinds of femininity and masculinity and so on. And the gender category is very elastic, so it's a quite flexible category, but it's not that flexible. There's still a fundament. There's still some kind of ground, ultimate ground. The idea of sex is still there. It's not gone away. So I mean, we just have to realize, I think, that the kind of thinking that Judith Butler have introduced in the gender theory field is not so common, even among feminists, and it's rather controversial still. So problematizing the whole distinction between sex and gender and the idea of gender as an essence, as a fixed identity, still seem to be still very much controversial, and maybe even more so today than 10, 20 years ago.
I think you answered that really well. I don't think I can add that much to the theoretical basis, but I do think that you can also see in the legal debates a real fear of erasure, or at least that's the way it's being framed. So, and in that you can kind of also trace the importance of these identity markers that we do have. So when there was a debate now recently about the Children's Act, where only a question was raised in the group that was assessing the act of whether or not we should introduce more gender neutral language. The result was this debate where it was argued that there had been a suggestion to replace the word mother with birth person, I think. which really flows off the tongue. But in fact, no one had actually suggested this. It had been discussed, and the group had decided that it was too complicated to actually do it, so they wouldn't do it. Despite this, we had a month discussion in the media where people were saying that I'm a mother and raising fear that this identity category would be taken from them.
Yeah, as if a gender-inclusive language would erase all mothers, all self-identity mothers.
And most often we don't let what the legal acts say in their wording necessarily determine what we call ourselves. So I would also say that people would be able to call themselves mother even if a different word was used in the act. But I think this kind of shows what people experience is at stake. And you could also see it in the debate. A couple of years ago, we got one joint anti-discrimination act. And there was a real concern from the women's movement that by taking away the previous Equality Act, we were in fact erasing women from legislation. And the more sort of rational, I suppose, argument you could raise there then is that the concern that we would stop seeing these gendered structures and stop the initiatives that we still have to sort of help women as a group in society to break down patriarchal norms. So I think for some of those people who are engaging in these debates who are not at the end of the polarized spectre, there's also a need to sort of meet and see where we actually, the fact that we include trans women, for example, is not a threat against the battle against the patriarchy. So I think that's something we really need to work on, to make spaces where feminists who really are working on breaking down gendered norms can actually come together and see that there isn't actually that much of a threat in transgender rights.
I just wanted to add on the first part of the question or the answer that even the bioessentialist facts or so-called facts that are brought by TERFs to support their hatred against trans people are wrong in the base of the biology they use. In the past 30 years, the biological science has found so many new evidence that suggests that biological sex is not just determined by chromosomes, and there are so many other things that play a role. And there is a huge amount of variance in the two existing categories of biological sexes that it's kind of impossible to contain all the sex variances in those two categories. And the category intersex was brought back again and lumped everything else back in there, but that's also not enough. So I think mostly TERFs and anti-trans movements hold on to this high school biology of 50 years ago as a weapon of being afraid to be excluded from their self-identifying categories, even though that's not the case. But they refuse to actually update their facts and see that the newer facts, even in biology, support otherwise.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I totally agree that the biological side of this is, I mean, if you look at research, there are so many things pointing beyond the binaries, and it's nothing new. I mean, this has been the case for many years, that you can't really say that there's something biologically determining or even common among women and men, and now also you have a lot of research on brains, and what you see all along is that there are more differences within these gender categories than between. But that doesn't mean that these categories stop being meaningful, and that's where politics and social norms come in, because these discussions are not based on science or based on facts at all. They are highly political questions, and social norms. Social norms, gender norms, are so strong that of course biological research or facts cannot change so much in the way we behave and debate these things. So what we should maybe rather focus on is the political framing of this, and see how we can link it to social justice issues instead of maybe biological research, because I don't think pointing to facts or research would be very helpful in this context.
We have another question from the live stream, and it also concerns these spectrums, but more of a neurodiverse spectrum. I'm trying to sum it up. Some of the arguments and discourse against trans people also involves invalidation because of neurodiversity. So there's a comment here: trans people can, for instance, not be autistic. In the process of seeking treatment, this is devalidating. It says the issue of neurotypicality is also of legal importance, since it reduces individual autonomies on the basis of not being mature enough to make decisions for one's own well-being. So if you want to say something about that.
So I'm not sure how much I can say from the legal perspective, but what I can say is that I think what is complicated in some of these debates is that you find this intersection between law and medicine, where law is really saying that this has to be based on medical assessment, and then you sort of get this intersection between rights and medical discourse. And this was what we saw also with the sterilization requirement when we did have that law was saying, and this is what's happening in the court cases concerning compensation as well. So what the law is saying is that, but we were only asking the medicine for what to help us translate what a full gender conversion would mean, while the medicine was saying that, oh, but we were only giving medical treatment, so we weren't thinking about the legal, we weren't doing anything to do with legal rights or legal gender. And what happens then is that no one takes responsibility for the position that trans people were put in. So trans people were put in a situation where they had to convince their medical practitioner that they wanted to undergo castration, because if they didn't do that, they wouldn't be able to change their legal gender. But then law is saying, oh, but these medical doctors, they did the best they could, and they would never have done this operation if they did not fully believe that the patient wanted it. But no one is taking responsibility for the fact that people were actually placed in an impossible situation where they would either have to give away their bodily autonomy or they would not be able to get their legal gender recognized. And in some cases that would mean that they were excluded from the workplace, they were exposed to violence. But in this cross-section between medicine and law, this point sort of disintegrates, and no one really takes responsibility for it. So I can't really go into the, I know of this debate when it comes to autism, but I don't know enough to comment on it particularly. But I do think that we need to have attention on how law and medicine works together in these issues.
Yeah, and I think again it's very much about politics and norms, and we know that the treatment in Norway, perhaps more so than in many other countries, have been based on very strict gender norms, and not even medicine because there's a lot of medical research pointing in different directions than the Norwegian medical experts have been practicing. But I think the main issue here is that you have to be totally normal in a way as a person in order to qualify. I mean, normal in normative way. You cannot be mentally ill, you cannot be physically ill, you cannot be even homosexual or queer, because that will disqualify you from being a proper woman or a proper man. So we see here that the cis-normativity, the gender norms are extremely strong, and those norms even contradict much of the medical evidence that we know are there. So I don't think, I mean, if you're going to explain what's happening at Rikshospitalet, you have to look at what kind of notions of gender they practice.
Last year was the year that we got the Discrimination Act. And I'm just wondering, non-binary people in Norway do not receive any medical treatment, or they do not have the right, even though that NBTK has the kjønnsinkongruens, gender incongruence, in their title. But I know that Helsedirektoratet, the health directorate, has said no, you are not allowed to be called that because you do not treat everyone with gender incongruence. But in how, I mean, non-binary people in Norway, their human rights for a necessity or medical treatment is denied. So in what way, legal way, can we help them? Because, I mean, we get the patient organization, we get many declines that we do not treat these people. This is a new group of people, even though they have existed for a very long time.
Yeah, it just came to my mind that the book we mentioned do actually have a discussion about some of these issues. Anne Hellum is discussing the conflict between anti-discrimination law and the anti-discrimination law and other laws, existing laws in Norway. And I think your question points to that contradiction or the conflict.
Yeah, it's definitely true. And I was sitting here sort of feeling a little bit squiggly when you were talking, because it's a really good point. And it's a little bit difficult to answer, because I kind of just want to say, like, take a case to the ombudsman or the equality nemnda that we have and raise the issue. But I'm not fully confident how it would end up. And it has a little bit to do with what I was saying in my previous comment, that as soon as medicine starts getting involved, law sort of pulls back a little bit. So when something is based on a medical assessment, law would only come in to assess whether or not that was done, that medical assessment can be seen as being good enough or not, if something really obviously is wrong with it. But I do think that in this issue, you see in some of the reports that have come from Helsedirektoratet now, they do recognize it themselves. They do say people have a right to treatment, yet we have this group that is not receiving treatment at all. There is nowhere to send them after they are rejected from the specialist unit. They're left with nothing. So in a way, there's already like written admission that this is not okay. But the problem, I think, is, and this is interesting, because we got the law on change of legal gender. It came really quickly. It did, when the politicians became aware of it and the process was started. It took very few years from the process of the law was started until we had the act. But a small part of that report that was written ahead of this act also looked at the problem of the treatment and the medical issues. And they raised a number of points that they said, this is what we need to do to provide health services. Yet we did get the Act on Change of Legal Gender, but nothing has happened when it comes to the medical issues. So there's a delay and a more of a hesitance to sort of actually address these issues. And I think it is because this is really where the gendered norms are being pressured in a sense. But yeah, you have the right to medical treatment, but you also have the right to legal recognition of your gender identity. And gender non-conforming, genderqueer people don't have that in Norway as of yet. I saw now recently that they will start a process to consider whether or not we should introduce a third legal gender option. And I guess we should all hope that that process is a positive one, and we should all be involved, maybe even write letters to the open hearings. But as of yet, we don't recognize people who don't identify as man or woman. And that, you could argue very strongly, is in violation with anti-discrimination.
And not only the Norwegian law, but also, I mean, the UN and international law.
I have another question. Trans masculine people or non-binary people or trans men in general do not have any rights based on their reproductive organs. How do you think we can win that? Because basically now we have the same sex. We have the bio law now saying that yes, two women can, donate eggs to one another. But if there is a trans man or trans masculine person or a non-binary person who would want to do that, that's not possible. I can change my legal gender back to a woman, and then I will have rights. But right now, I don't have rights.
Yeah, I guess it's the same issue here, and but I do think that there is perhaps a possibility of doing something on that now that we do have a new government. There are processes when it comes to third legal gender, and I do think these issues should be raised. But what it really, really shows is that even when the law is trying to do good by recognizing that the previous practice of castration was bad, that people should be able to self-determine their legal gender, it still often happens in very normative ways. So there are some people who are being recognized, but unfortunately it is the binary trans people, those who can fit then easily into the other category. And I think to some extent this is also just a result of lack of awareness in the legislation process as well. Because when I was looking at the anti-discrimination legislation, for example, it's very explicitly said that now you cannot be discriminated on the basis of your gender identity. And trans people are protected based on gender identity. But what that means is that if you, for example, are a trans woman who passes as a woman, and you're being discriminated as a woman, then you're not really covered by the gender option, because you can never fully be a woman. You're still covered by the gender identity. And it just sort of shows that the law still really struggles with understanding any sort of non-normativity where trans people are going outside of the traditional roles of men and women. So I think we really need to sort of try to push these issues, and I do think that the whole queer community needs to show solidarity and to assist in that sort of struggle now. That we have, some of us have rights, but not all of us have rights.
Yeah, not only queer community, but the majority. I think there's been very little solidarity so far from the majority population regarding queer issues or trans issues.
I have also the last question, maybe regarding your studies when you mentioned the right of seeking asylum based on the gender identity, and that you didn't find any cases except one. Why you think this is what happened? Why you think this is the situation?
I think in part it was chance, so far as you can say chance in a sense, because I think there are a lot fewer cases than sexual minority cases. And I got a random selection of cases. So I don't necessarily think the immigration authorities were keeping trans cases away on purpose, but I think it was quite difficult for them to identify the trans cases and provide them to me. Because what I saw was that I think I got 147 cases concerning male, cis male applicants who either self-identified as gay or who were assessed as being gay. So that's I think it's almost over 75% of the total amount of cases that I got. And that also meant that it was quite difficult for me to look at gendered issues and issues of bisexuality because I got so few cases. But my concern is that when I see guidelines for how to treat SOGI-esque cases, so sexual orientation, gender identity, all of these cases, they seem to very much be based on the data gotten from cases concerning gay men. So then a concern would be, do they adequately sort of prepare caseworkers for how to deal with gender issues and issues with bisexual applicants, women, all of these other issues as well. Yes, and unfortunately I can't provide a clear answer, but there has been a research from Sweden which shows that the Swedish immigration authorities unfortunately often confuses gender identity and sexuality. So my colleague there found cases where trans women would be addressed as he, in the decisions it would say that they were gay even if they weren't gay, and that they were focusing on the wrong sort of things because they were expecting them to talk about sexuality, and then they talked about gender expression or gender instead. So that's a concern that I think we should have more research on it.
What do you both think about who should take accountability when it always seems like trans people, gender non-conforming people, non-binary people, all of these people seem to fall in the middle in nearly every situation that they live in? If it comes to law, if it comes to rights, if it comes to medical treatments, or in academia as well, like in research. I mean, I think there is harder historically to research on trans people, if I'm not wrong, then correct me. But what do you think needs to be done to make these things better in a way?
Well, I think we have to answer that. Like, I mean, I have to highlight the political, and I guess you have to highlight the legal, and together we should perhaps try to see how also the legal field is politicized, and also how politics use the law to legitimate things or norms. So I think a joint effort between the legal sector and politics would be the way forward.
I think that's a really good point. And I was thinking the same thing, that in a sense we need to reach across our disciplines, because I think what we're talking about really shows is that there's this fragmentation where no one takes responsibility for trans lives, in a sense. And that happens both within politics and within law. And often, as I was saying, with the medical discourse, it happens with the law saying, we're not responsible for this, and medicine saying, oh, but we're also not responsible for this. So then we need these joint efforts. We need to sort of show the responsibility by saying that it's not sufficient to sit in your own pocket and say, this is not my responsibility. Because then you will see these fragmentations where trans lives are sort of falling in the cracks, and no one is recognizing them.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I think I do recognize what you're saying, Andrea, about the law is doing this. not taking accountability, because I witnessed the court case of Tobias, and it was kind of horrible to watch. They basically said it was his fault.
So I can just mention what happened there. There was a lot of technical legal issues that I will not touch upon about when or where a right to gender recognition happened. Did it happen in 2019 or in 2016? Lots of legal technicalities there that we can leave aside. But in the end, one of the things they asked was whether or not Tobias, who went to the courts, and what he argued was that he was pressured into undergoing an irreversible medical procedure that he didn't need and he didn't really want. He definitely didn't want it. But he was pressured to do it because it was the only way to gain legal recognition of his gender. And in the end, what the question became was whether or not he had given a valid sort of acceptance to receive this treatment. And the law said basically that, well, he came to his doctors and he said that he wanted this treatment. And the doctors asked him many times if he wanted this treatment. And look at his journal. He had lots of meetings with different doctors where he says that he wanted this. So how could the doctors know that he didn't? Well, how could they ever know what he wanted as long as society had created a system where he had to convince his doctors that he did want it, or he would never gain legal recognition? And that didn't just happen by coincidence. That was the law was a part of deciding that this would be a requirement. And I would argue that as long as this was a legal requirement, the medical professionals could never know whether or not a person really wanted treatment or not.
No, that's correct, because I think he only wanted it so he could travel.
Exactly, yeah.
And that was the only reason. He then decided to get the treatment.
So this case has been, or is being challenged at the European Court of Human Rights. Unfortunately, very few cases are accepted there, so we can't even be sure that it will be accepted. But this is also where I think it's important that we also see these issues from a political perspective. Because even if these court cases ends up not winning recognition for trans people, we shouldn't sort of end the struggle there. There should still be a political struggle for the state to recognize that what they did was wrong, whether or not they're convicted for it at the courts. So yeah, I think that's a big challenge ahead that we should continue working with.
And again, I think it illustrates very well that these issues are political, and that we see again and again that people comply with the requirements. They tell the stories they know they have to tell in order to qualify, either in this, in front of a doctor, or in front of asylum seeker. Interrogation in the interviews. So we see it again and again that people they learn how to answer questions, because that's the only way to get access.
Thank you. Is there
Thank you.